What is fact and what is truth? How does this all come together at a highland wedding in Papua New Guinea? Hello, welcome to Tales Under the Cat Tree. I'm your host, Dupes. Each week, I pair a compelling piece of fiction or autobiography with bigger topics. Words create the worlds we live in, and stories provide a lens into understanding history, technology, or business by connecting personal narratives to the wider picture. Subscribe at tales.dupes.ca for more original writing and engaging interviews. Today, I welcome Dr. Erwin Warkentin again to Tales Under the Cat Tree. First, he is going to read a piece that I have written called The Bride Price, and then we have a conversation.
The Bride Price. For 40 years now, the axe has gathered dust in my father's study, a mean-looking beak fastened to a sturdy, roughly hewn wooden handle. A single blow from such a weapon, delivered with enough force, would knock out even the hardiest of warriors. The fearsome point is the carved beak of a cassowary bird, a flightless bird native to Papua New Guinea, where the axe was handcrafted. The axe is a reminder of a memory from a village in the highlands outside the capital of Port Moresby. We moved from Sri Lanka to Papua New Guinea at the turn of a decade. Betamax was fighting VHS for dominance, and Princess Diana and Prince Charles's wedding was still a couple of years away. PNG, as we all called the country, had received independence from Australia almost 5 years before, in 1975. The currency, Kina, was riding high, and we were expatriates. My father, a doctor, was to run the medical center at the University of PNG in Port Moresby. PNG at that time felt as if it were still at the edges of modern civilization. Television was non-existent, and we watched videotapes delivered weekly to the library from somewhere in Australia. Outside the metropolis of Port Moresby, highlands and jungles engulfed the land, hiding various factional tribes. If there was a country that still hid its secrets in the early 1980s, we had certainly found it here. At the grand age of 6, I was far too small to know many things. I did not, for example, understand things like gangs, tribes, secessionists, and the intricate workings of global economies where the price of copper would have such an impact on the livelihoods of the people I encountered. I did, however, know that you had to be careful. Gang members named rascals operated in our neighborhood. I knew that the reason our house was on stilts was to prevent the numerous deadly animals from crawling in from the jungle and to save us from flooding. I did also know that somehow my dad's job made him slightly special. Between jungle threats, man-made violence, and invisible bugs, my father's university clinic was a busy place. The free clinic and my father served just about everyone, no questions asked. Word went out that if you harmed the doctor or his family, well, I guess I actually don't know fully what the outcome would have been. The once a beaten man was sent with an apology after he or someone had tried to grab my mother. Our house and family were spared many indignities, including having the only non-burgled house on our street. Being a local doctor also came with some other perks, including the one that resulted in the axe that sat in my father's study. My father had helped cure some chieftain of a village, and as such, we were invited to a wedding in the highlands outside the city. One sunny day, we piled into our beige Datsun Sunny for a long ride through the mountains. I have only one vivid mental image from this journey, and it is that of distant blue mountains from the side of an orange clay road. The air was buzzing with commotion and insects when we entered the village. I remember we were invited to a gathering at a big house, but I wandered away from the family to look at the various weapons, masks, and other decorations. This was not an ordinary wedding, as this chief's child was marrying someone from another village. If you know anything about PNG, it is that it is the home of the famed birds of paradise, The blue, red, green, and yellow plumage adorned the many headpieces, clothing, and masks. As with the houses I had now become accustomed to, the houses here were scattered down a steep hillside on stilts. The muddied roads went this way and that. At a certain time, we all gathered as the ceremony began. We looked up the hillside from which the main road came. Over the rise entered warriors and a loud procession carrying the so-called bride price. Dowries and bride prices no longer exist or are illegal for good reason. But in the early 1980s in PNG, this was still common. A funny custom about the bride price in PNG, at least in this case, and as explained by my father, was that it could not touch the ground. So first came people with animals and birds skewered or attached to sticks, and still others carrying pots on their heads. Next came men with poles adorned with hundreds of kina notes. However, the true wonder for a 6-year-old boy came at the end, accompanied by shouts and exclamations. Over the rise appeared a coterie of men with large poles balanced on their shoulders, on which stood the main gift, a brand new gleaming pickup truck carried from the other village without muddying the wheels. With the bride price settled, the village went into full party mode. I do remember that we had to get back. These were not the days of far-flung hotels or Airbnbs. I'm sure I slept the whole way back to Port Moresby, dreaming of flying trucks and bright birds. In the trunk, we carried an axe as a souvenir. Now it sits, dusty, a relic and a memory of a bygone era from a country far away.
Erwin, welcome back to Tales Under the Cat Tree. It's my pleasure to have you here again. And just to remind our listeners, you are...
Yeah, I'm a retired professor of German and communication studies. One of the things that kind of kept me going in my career was publishing. That is, I published on, first of all, literary topics, but then also spent a lot of time working in the area of political warfare and in propaganda. So that's kind of what has turned my crank, but I do love going back to literature.
Fantastic. The premise of this is, if you have listened to some of our earlier episodes between myself and Dr. Warkentin, one of the first, I read a piece that Erwin had written that talked about his childhood in Winnipeg. Then we talked about the aspect of biography. One of the promises I made to Erwin was that I would give him something from my life and I would have Erwin read it. And of course, you've just listened to that, which is The Bride Price. So this is the conversation after.
Hey, this really does feel like old times again, doesn't it? You've given me something to read and to analyze and to presumably make some sort of judgment on. Am I correct?
That would be correct. Are you going to give me a mark out of something for this one?
Well, I can tell you ahead of time, I really like the story. So you can rest at ease. Yes, it may feel like a bit of an interrogation at times, but not to worry. I'll be gentle. I'll just kind of give you a bit of a background on what I've been thinking here, what I've kind of come up with since I read the story. I'm someone who made a living to an extent through being a literary critic, that is, reading stories and talking about them. I've read stuff like short stories, novels, novellas, plays, poems, the occasional haiku, and then I talk about it and I write about it. Now, that's a really nice life to have. There are various approaches that you can take to a piece like this. You can use formalism, for example, or new criticism, where we just kind of focus on the text itself. Or we can use something like historical or biographical criticism, which would lend itself really well to the story as well. And that's more a positivist approach, where I'm saying, okay, well, dupes, this is kind of a biographical piece, and, how does that work with your life? Where does it come from? There's also things like Marxist criticism, feminist criticism, psychoanalytic criticism, reader response criticism, structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstructionism, new historicism, cultural studies, post-colonial criticism, and I was so tempted to apply post-colonial criticism in this case, but I kind of left that aside. Queer theory, eco-criticism, archetypical or myth criticism, critical race theory is something we could also have used here, structural feminism, intersectionality, and digital and media criticism. So which of these am I going to employ? Well, none of them. Well, at the same time, actually, all of them. I have to kind of come clean on this. I'm an adherent of Terry Eagleton's political approach. For Eagleton, all criticism is political, whether one admits it or not. Even critics who claim to be objective or aesthetic in their criticism are still expressing some sort of ideological position, usually the values of the dominant class or culture. And here I'm really talking about what I'm going to do in approaching your story. Political criticism is not about turning literature into propaganda, but about being self conscious and honest about the political dimensions of literature and interpretation. So there is a definite, even as a 5 year old, there is a political dimension to this. It allows me to use all of these tools and achieve some sort of political, cultural, social understanding and what it is that we want to pass on to others. As much about what you want to pass on to, and by talking about it, I also want to pass something on to others in engaging with the short story that you've created. In other words, every act of reading, teaching, or interpreting literature is bound up with the questions of power, ideology, and social interest. Okay, now let's get to the work at hand. This is where I start asking questions of the text. I found it interesting that mountains are significant in your writing. They're significant in this piece, but I also have the benefit of having known you for quite some time. And I know your photography, I know things you've written, and mountains are a big deal. So, what's with the mountains?
They're big. I will be a little less flippant. I think for me, there is a sense of where nature, and one of the things that I loved in Canada is the sense of the ginormity of nature and us as such a small part of that world. And as you know, one of my favorite artists is Caspar David Friedrich. His artwork as well, that romanticism of nature as being such a big force in humans and inside of me. And one of the most amazing things growing up on islands and next to the ocean is that feeling, the same feeling of a mountain. It's so big and so vast, and it is uncontrollable, undeniable. It sticks in your head. It eats into your imagination. It is what it is. And when you come to a place like Newfoundland, for example, where there is no mountains per se, but the water is rough and it has a life force. It has an energy. It talks to you. You can hear it. In that sound, there is a depth to its anger, to its calm, to its peace. And then I moved to the Rockies, where when I look up, I see mountains and they also speak to me. And I think even as a kid, I was always fascinated by something bigger than me, something bigger than what I could control, that I wanted to be a part of, whether it is to climb them, whether it's to sail on them, whether it is to just sit next to them. Would that make sense? Now, that is a very adult view of myself at 6. I think possibly I hadn't actually seen any mountains at that point that were that big, and probably saw them and went, wow, that's huge. And somehow that stuck in my head.
Well, I mean, yeah, we're adults now, but there's still that childlike, and I have to say that it spoke to the child in me. It's almost as if I had the same experience as I was reading the piece. It kind of spoke to these universals that children have and that kind of remain with us as we become adults and we become older. And maybe because I'm older now, I'm over 65, I'm starting to reflect back on my life. And so I think this is what twigged in me, was this reflection when I was a 5-year-old. I remember these car trips.
One of the interesting things about that time as well, and I can't remember when it was, and it might have been before we went to Papua New Guinea. My dad was in the World University Organization, whatever it's called, WUC, I think. But I do remember something about him having gone to Kenya for some conference. The thing that I remember him talking about at that age, so at the 5, 6, 7-year-old age, was how he saw Mount Kilimanjaro. Like, it was just something that stuck with him. And that set of comments at 5, 6 years old stuck with me all the way till I was 30. And I went and climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And I know for a fact, and I talked to him about it because he was still alive at that point, and it was fundamentally because of those few things that were put into my head when I was 5, 6, 7 years old. And I just wanted to be there.
Okay, that explains a lot. This text is a reflective narrative that explores themes of memory, cultural immersion, and the intersection of tradition and modernity. It recounts the narrator's childhood experiences in Papua New Guinea in the early 1980s, and it focuses on a very specific event, a wedding in the highlands, and the symbolic significance of the acts gifted to the narrator's father. So why is this important?
Which part? The axe? I don't think the axe is important at all, except for the fact that it just jogs my memory whenever I see it. But do you mean, for example, why this was important?
Well, the whole thing. Why is it important that I, as a reader, should read this?
And this is one of the interesting things when you sit down to write something, you wonder why anyone would want to read something as silly as my own memories. I decided, for me, this particular story is in and of itself a fascinating look into a place and a time that I will never go back to, that nobody in this world can go back to. I can't remember exactly my feeling. I just remember the sheer, I guess, incongruity, seeing something that should be on the ground and being driven, being carried by people for the sake of a wedding. That thing has stuck in my head for ever since then. That incongruity.
It is a bit of a bizarre image, and I'm going to want to come back to that Toyota truck being carried. I also notice that there's kind of this sense of wonder and curiosity as this child navigates a foreign land that is kind of rich in traditions and contrasts and challenges that he has no clue about. It's all new. So what's the most significant takeaway for the reader? Or am I being shallow, trying to limit it to one thing?
I don't know if you're being shallow. I don't know what I think the reader should take from it. In a good story, I would hope that a reader takes whatever they wish to see it from it, whether it's their own childhood memory of something so incongruous, whether it's them discovering a new place and a new land, a new country. I know I've been lucky, and I know that I was very young and placed into, but I was young enough, but old enough to know that it was very different from where I was born. So obviously I could see that this was fundamentally different. And remember, when I showed up in Papua New Guinea at 4.5, 5, I couldn't speak English. And so I had to learn a new language to navigate the world as it was around me. So I would have been learning, for me, everything was new. Everything was alien.
I'm going to tell you what I took away from this. It's not any of these symbols. It's not none of this other stuff that we often as literary critics talk about. But for me, it was a feeling. And that feeling was the same feeling that I had when I was about 5 or 6 in the back of my parents' 1953 Pontiac, driving back from the farm. In my life, I grew up right in the middle of Winnipeg, but we would spend the weekends out on the farm. All of my other relatives had farms out in southern Manitoba. So I had the strange experience of kind of being uprooted from this really loud, noisy, busy place right downtown, then being taken out to the farm where there were the traditional sorts of things happening. And this is, the typical Mennonite things. No, we didn't ride around in buggies. My uncle had a Lincoln Continental. We were thoroughly modern. And then it was that drive home on Sunday. It was dark. It was, 8 o'clock, and I would lie across the back of the seat of this 53 Pontiac. And the way they were built, I could just kind of look out the window upward. I could see the stars. In reading this story, that feeling, that trip home, that for me, that was so nostalgic. It gave me a feeling rather than, some sort of intellectual clarity on something. How do you feel about that?
I think you're spot on. Whenever I think about these kind of stories in my life, it is just a feeling. It's that and trying to get that feeling down into words that another person can see. So, and this is the interesting thing thinking about writing. And I talk about this at work all the time in terms of how people communicate. A human talks to another human. In your head, you make up all the things that you want to say. Like all of the nuances you want to get across, the feelings, the everything else. Unfortunately, all of that incredible stuff then gets boiled down into a set of words. And those words come out of your mouth. And when they come out of your mouth, they have intonations, they have different little, ways of talking, and your eyes and your facial expressions make up the rest of the communication. Now, the other person sits there and they take this in. They take the visual cues, the oral cues, but then they have to take all those words and then they have to reinterpret them back into their heads. And you layer in all the rest of that communication piece. Now, it's a wonder we don't end up in fights all the time. There's so little that actually transmits from one to another. And the written word is even worse. Because when you write with certain words, certain adjectives, certain ways, certain styles, certain idioms, and then you give it to somebody else. And that person reads it, but they don't read it with my voice. They don't read it with my feelings. They read it with yours. I say you're neither right nor wrong, but I am glad that I was able to get across a feeling.
And I think that's one of the important aspects that we often miss when we do literary criticism. And that is this feeling that's generated within us. And I think what you're talking about is, yes, we interpret all of this in our head, but we forget about the heart. And the heart's a significant part of this. Now, back to the bride price. Okay, you have this elaborate procession of the bride price. It includes a pickup truck being carried. It's, to me, kind of symbolizes the value placed on tradition, community, and honor in Papua New Guinea. But what do you do with this new artifact? Well, it's the blending of the two, I think, that's happening that's important here. Is it to the point, however, of being bizarre, or to the point of having this alienating effect, Befremdungseffect, if you remember, a la Bertolt Brecht?
I do remember, yes.
I think it also reflects a certain cultural significance of marriage and the lengths to which people will go to upholding these sorts of customs, even in the face of modern influences. So it's kind of this modern influence coming crashing in, even to the point of absurdity. Perhaps the narrator is trying to underline the absurdity of marriage itself.
Ooh, now that's very deep. Am I going to talk about marriage itself and its absurdities? No, I think as a 5 or 6 year old, that definitely wasn't even in my head, but I do think there is one interesting thing that I left out, and the reason why I left it out is I have these recollections, but I can't quite tell you what they were, and I would hate to misrepresent anything, frankly. So I was very clear on the facts I chose to put in. As we talked about in biography, you choose things, right? In this case, when I was wandering around that village, there were other things especially in the hut that we were, or the house that we were invited to. Looking back now as an adult, I think what I was seeing were maybe shrunken heads or replicas of shrunken heads and things like that in that area, in that village. And I think I found all of this stuff very, very strange. So in some ways, the car coming was probably no more stranger than everything else I had seen at this point.
I know a little bit about Papua. I've never been there, but there's a gentleman that I met years and years and years ago, and he's always kind of stuck with me. And he was from Papua New Guinea, and the stories that he told. Yeah, the shrunken heads and things like kind of false, but in my case, it'd be false memories of the place because...
Well, and that's what I'm afraid of in my case too, because I think that's one of the other really interesting things about writing something from that far back in your childhood. And we talked about that when I read yours. This writing, I'm writing now, 40 years on from the actual event. And there are snippets of pictures in my head. And there's snippets of feelings from that. And I'm trying to put all that into words. I also have, since then, of course, had so many more experiences and I've studied so much more that I'm always worried that I'm actually putting back in things that weren't there. And so when I was going through and trying to catalog through my memories exactly which part I put in and which part I don't, I actually went to the ones which are the strongest memories, the ones that I know from that.
Another interesting thing was, now you'd mentioned, my story, your story, they both end with a car trip.
They do. It's interesting. When I was writing it, I noticed that I wrote the first draft and I had put the fact that the car was a beige Datsun Sunny. And initially, I was actually going to remove it in my second draft because I was like, why does it matter that it's a beige Dastan Sunny? But it did. So my dad had always had basically, I think, secondhand cars. And there were all these like British Austins and Austin Minis and Morris Minors. This was his first Japanese new car. And I remember him going to buy it, going to a car showroom for the first time and buying this Datsun Sunny. It had a new car smell. I think I loved being in that car.
Overall, I think the text is a meditation on memory, cultural exchange, and the enduring impact of experiences that shape one's understanding of the world. I see it as using the axe and the wedding as symbols of connection, respect, and a blending of tradition and personal history. So I have to ask, how much of this is true and how much of this is factual?
And this, as I said to you about implanting false memories and things like that. So on the one side, I was very afraid of making sure, or very concerned with making sure that I put the correct memories into place. That's on the one side. That's the what memories do I put in? But you asked a very specific question. What is factual and what is truthful?
That's right. And they're two different things.
Because I can spell out facts in a way that make it a lie. And I can tell you a pile of truths that look non-factual. Which is it in this case? I would love to tell you. And I can tell you certain things that I have chosen not to put in here, which make certain parts of the story kind of flow through. I don't talk about the fact that, for example, my father didn't have that many nurses in this little clinic and things would happen all the time. And I used to be one of the nurses at 6, 7 years old, which I'm sure is illegal in some way, shape, or form. Even back then, there's family dynamics that aren't mentioned. I have chosen very carefully to construct a narrative that gets across a feeling of a specific event and a place and time.
I'd like to end this with a very specific question. Is it an amalgam of different experiences assembled into an experience that would have been nice to have? Or is it a reflection on what life has taught you through the myriad of experiences you've had that are completely unlike those described here?
I think it's definitely not the first. That while I may be missing out certain factors which may or may not make it, more or less personal and things like that, I don't think it's that first. But it is probably the second. I am definitely reflecting back my thoughts across the years to a point.
One of the things that we've done here with this, and this is, for me, this is a real eye-opener, is I would have loved to have sat down with all of the authors that I've analyzed over the years and had exactly an exchange like this with them. Did I get this right? Did I get that? Am I understanding this properly? It's just really enlightening to be able to speak to the author and ask questions of not just the text, but the intentionality, I suppose, if we even can talk about such a thing, behind what was written there and what I've read. I think for you, it's also kind of eye-opening to see someone or have someone talk about your literary work, then reflect back to you something that is almost foreign. It's like a mirror that is imperfect, that has waves of so you can kind of recognize what's there, but not at the same time.
No, I agree with you. I think literary criticism, when it's done to your face, is very different. And it's hard to know how to answer the questions. Because sometimes when you write and you're trying to get a feeling across, you just write and you justify what you've written after the fact, just like you justify the actions you do after the fact. It's hard to put into words why you may have done or done something. Now, could it be that I have read something similar in my life somewhere, something from the Heart of Darkness or something like that? Who knows, right? And somehow that triggered me to keep, to write something like this of my own life. You didn't ask me, for example, I could have titled this story a million ways, but I chose The Bride Price. Now that I am 100% sure is coming from my own adult view of this.
I look at titles of works as the author taking me by the hand and saying, I want you to explore it in this direction. So by calling it the bride price, I'm reading it and saying, okay, I'm looking for this bride price here, I'm being focused on that particular aspect of the story. What's important for me is to be able to break away from some of that and maybe surprise you with some of my questions because I've looked at other aspects of what you've got there.
As an author or as a writer, and you know this, we want to target your attention or the reader's attention on a certain area. Sometimes it's to hide you from asking the questions about the other area.
What you're saying is we should trust the reader?
I think every reader's interpretation of any other writing is exactly that. The moment I put something down on paper and you consume it, it is no longer mine. It is the reader's.
Ooh, I just had had kind of like a funny tick going back to a graduate class that I took somewhere at some point, the reader, once it's out there, it doesn't belong to the author anymore.
No, it does not. Like, The Hobbit speaks to me in ways that I don't think it speaks to other people. Tolkien didn't write it for me. Tolkien may have written it for a whole pile of different stories or reasons, for his children, for whatever he was going through in from World War I. Who knows? For me, The Hobbit is my story. It is something like parts of it are for me. Another one is Ursula K. Le Guin's The Wizard of Earthsea, which stands to the test of time. I've read it as a kid. I've read it as an adult. And I see two very different stories, but they are both mine. And the interpretation I take from it are mine.
Now, this is only related very tangentially to this, but have you been to the pub that Tolkien frequented in Oxford?
I have.
You have. And you sat in that same corner, did you? And consumed a beer.
I did.
Exactly what I did.
Of course I did. And I'll go back again.
Yep. I gotta meet you there sometime.
We should do that.
Yeah, we should.
Fantastic. Okay, so is my grilling at an end, Dr. Warkentin? Have I passed the course?
Yeah, your grilling is at it, and you passed the course, I think, with flying colors.
Oh my goodness!
Like I said, I enjoyed reading it, first of all, immensely, and part of it had to do with it triggered this emotional response. So yes, you have passed with flying colors.
All right, sir. Thank you very much. And, you're going to come back on the show. And in fact, we're going to try and do a live interview in person in the next couple of months. So I think listeners will have a lot more of Dr. Erwin Warkentin, at least on this podcast.
I don't know if that's a good thing.
It's a great thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Tales Under the Cat Tree. If you want more original stories and interviews, check out the archives wherever you listen to this podcast. We've covered topics and stories about immigration, artificial intelligence, Stalinist Russia, and otherization, to name but a few. If you have fiction writing you want to feature, or have an interesting story to tell, or know someone who does, please do get in touch with me. This podcast will always be free. Support our work by subscribing and sharing with those who might care. You can reach me through email, contact@dups.ca, bluesky@dups.ca, or on my Substack at tales.dups.ca. The intro music is composed by me. Give your pet a cuddle and your loved ones a hug till we meet again for some Tales Under the Cat Tree.